This is our future Bitcoin mining panel, and we've already been talking about mining, so it just kind of was like a nice little segue. This is not going to be a boring Bitcoin mining panel. It's going to be very interesting. These guys are super smart and very entertaining. So we've already heard from Danny a little bit. I'm Rosa Shores. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Blockspaces. We are working on Bitcoin native financial infrastructure. We believe that there's going to be lots of companies that are going to have Bitcoin in treasury, as well as businesses that need to do things like collateralize their assets. And we have this pristine collateral that is on traditional financial rails. It kind of is a moot point. So we're building Bitcoin native financial infrastructure. So joining me today, of course, Bob Burnett. Everybody knows we were just at lunch and somebody said, ooh, Bitcoin celebrity. So that was cool. He's great. Mark is joining us. David and Danny, who you guys have already met. So this is going to be a really great panel, and I promise you, it will not be boring. I'll sit right here. Yeah.
A little bit more quiet. I'm going to bring your mic up a little bit.
Okay.
Everybody, the closer it is to the chin, the easier it is going to work on the mics.
Okay. All right. So this was actually a really good segue. So even though I think Charlie just got here, of course. So Charlie was running a little late, but it was a really good segue. Since we already had Mark and Bob up here talking about Ocean and some of the amazing things that they're doing. We love that project. So I think Danny did a really great kind of overview of Bitcoin mining, and it seems like everybody in the audience is pretty savvy, but maybe do kind of a quick overview just so we can all level set on what is mining and why is it so important.
Yeah, so I'm back. What's up? Talked about, I think, to give a very, very brief recap of my presentation, that was more focused on kind of like mining 101. We wanted to provide these insights to folks. And I think I took the lens of talking a little bit about the utility that that Bitcoin miners play, towards the network, but also talked about like the economic incentive to mine Bitcoin, right? Why do people mine Bitcoin? How can you mine Bitcoin? So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I think we'll probably take it a little bit further into the deep end. I had a bunch of folks ask me a lot of great questions, so this is meant to continue that journey.
Awesome. And, Mark, just kind of piggybacking on what you were just talking about, one of the topics that John thought would be really interesting was this whole kind of concept of centralization FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But that's actually not really FUD, is it? I mean, the centralization of mining is a real thing.
Yeah, it's real. It's one of, I believe it's one of the biggest threats to Bitcoin today. And the reality is that when you send Bitcoin, we're thinking about layer 2 adoption and store of value and unit of account and medium of exchange. But every time we send a Bitcoin or some Satoshis, it gets included in a block, right? And there is probably an 80% chance that block is going to be found by Antpool or the consortium of companies that Antpool controls, or it's going to be found by Foundry. So you really have two entities that get to decide whether or not that you get to use Bitcoin. And so I think it's a bit of an illusion that Bitcoin is a free and open technology if there is such a high degree of centralization of concentration of power over the decision of who gets to use it. And it's a matter of nation state adoption. I think we're going to get into it, but Bitcoin is going to be a competitive landscape, and I think countries will use their power to potentially prevent others from getting their transactions into the blockchain. So who gets to use Bitcoin is not up to the miner. It's not up to the user. Currently it's up to the mining pool, and the centralization that's currently in existence is, it does get labeled as FUD, but I believe it's a reality.
Yeah, totally agree. And, Bob, you talk about that, like the different kind of levels, and that's such a great spiel that you always do about how you kind of categorize different levels of miners. Can you just kind of share that with the audience? Because I always love listening to that.
Sure. I think we can divide the mining community into three large buckets, and I call them rabbits, horses, and elephants. The elephants are probably pretty obvious. They would be the really large commercial miners, mostly the Pupcos, the Marathons and the Riots and the Clean Sparks. They build these very, very large facilities, 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, gigawatts, some of them talk about. They are big and powerful. Their hash rate does help secure the network, so I don't want to come off as overly critical of them, but is at the same time that they're big and powerful, they're also very difficult to put up. They take a long time to put up and a lot of capital. They're impossible to move. They're pretty much stationary, and they're what I call easy to hunt. So in a world where regulators, tax authorities, bureaucrats want to attack mining, they're kind of sitting ducks. Maybe I should have called them ducks. So on the other end of the spectrum, we have the rabbits. We saw the BitAxe earlier, the BitAxe giveaway. People running BitAxes or an S9 in their garage, God bless them, would love to see millions and tens of millions of people doing that. Rabbits individually aren't very powerful, but collectively they can make a difference. And you think about a farmer's field and say, one rabbit in a field of cabbage doesn't really matter, but thousands of rabbits cause a lot of problems. And if the farmer comes out and starts trying to hunt the rabbits, they scatter. He'll catch a few, but he'll never catch them all. And so maintaining a really large and material collection of rabbits is very important to the security of the network because they are the most immune from ever being attacked. And the horses sit in the middle. My company sits in the middle. I think I put Danny's company in the middle too. We are horses. We are small to medium-sized commercial miners.
Thoroughbred horses.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, not Shetland ponies.
Stallions.
Just to make it
Yeah.
Stallions. Wild Broncos.
wild stallions.
Yes. So, what's nice about these are we can generally bring them up quickly. If something happens, we can move the hash rate. We can sometimes move the containers if it's that kind of facility. So we're very mobile. We're often very difficult to find. Like one of my sites I talk about is a place in South Dakota, and we have 2 megawatts of mining in 2 containers sitting on the backside of a burrito factory. And good luck looking through South Dakota and finding it. Even if I tell you where the burrito factories are, you can figure that out. It'll be very hard to find them. So it's hard to find where the horses are. It's hard to hunt them. We need lots of rabbits and horses because we can't stop the elephants from multiplying, and we can't let them take over. And a lot of the reason that the hash rate is so centralized that Mark talked about is because we really don't have a lot of very principled organizations in the elephant class. They direct their hash rate to these larger pools. I won't bore you with why so much right now, but they don't care as much. And so we have a threat. It's very, very important. The moral of the story is very important that the horses and the rabbits, and don't minimize, go out and buy a BitAxe and run it, and don't think that you're not making a difference, because you are collectively.
Excellent. And David, everybody here has already met everybody else on this stage, but do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and then kind of give your perspective on all this?
Sure. My name is David Branscum. The easiest way to say it is I'm kind of a Bitcoin mining consultant, all the way from energy and site location, services, building, infrastructure, mining operations, whatever, just kind of fill the gaps. I'm from Texas, where the hash rate comes from. We have, Texas has about, I know Bob likes that.
Elephant country.
Elephant country. Well, there's quite a few Broncos there too, but we have, just by nature of Texas, the Texas grid being deregulated, there's an awful lot of power that comes out of West Texas, the West Load Zone, that it's hard to transport power, right? It's expensive, and you lose a lot of power the further you have to ship it. So there is a ton of mining. I think I can't remember what the last number was, but in North and South America combined, it's easily probably 25, maybe even a third of the hash rate is in just that West Texas area. It's probably safe to say 12 to 15% of global hash rate happens in that West Texas area. It's just by nature. Some of the things that, and I've worked with some of the large pubcos on some things. I've worked with these rabbits that are, I call them maybe large, right? Giant lop-eared or whatever, where they're running 500 kW, less than a megawatt, but they're, getting into it. 10, 20 megawatts, kind of, some larger horses that are kind of on the edge, stuff like that. And it is a double-edged sword, right? Because you have these elephants that are powerful, and the more nation states get involved, right? If the nation state, like for example, the U.S. decides they want to do something that we as the community deem bad for Bitcoin, you want those elephants on your side to a certain degree, right? They're in the sandbox playing. You can't just completely get them out, but at the same time, you do have to be careful. So that's why the rabbit. It's all about a balance. When you Mark was saying earlier, it's like your freedom to choose is so important, right? One of my favorite books is If You Can Keep It by Eric Metaxas, where he talks about just freedom in general. It's the U.S. as a republic. The democratic policies that we have, all this, it's all there if you can keep it. And so is Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't choose what it does, right? It just is. It is what it is. It's a tool. And so it's up to us to decide how it gets used, where it gets used. And if the nation states continue to adopt, one of the biggest challenges is going to be if the U.S. has Bitcoin and they decide they want to transact with another country in Bitcoin, and we're talking about huge transactions, right? It's not a matter of what it costs to send that transaction. It's a matter of does Russia have so much hash rate, or another China or some other country have so much hash rate, they are controlling the templates with their pools, and now they're going to just exclude our transaction because of the way that the U.S. wants to do it. So this is the next, and we may actually not be there for, even with everything, all the excitement, we may not be there for quite some time, but eventually you will have this kind of like a hash war or whatever, where countries are we're competing for that. The same way we compete for gold, the same way we compete through the bond market, sell off our debt, all of that. Bitcoin is all moving that direction, right? But the network is what determines how that happens, right? So it's super important to understand the basics of mining. It's super important to understand the network and how the mempool works, how the transactions work, block templates, and nodes. Also, the second thing I would say is, run a BitX and then get yourself a node. You get a node, you have cold storage, you have your Bitcoin off the network in cold storage. No one can touch it unless you decide you want to move it. And then you have your own node, whether it's chain or lightning, whatever the case may be. And you completely control your ability to transact your wealth and your money. That puts you in a completely different mindset that helps you see all the rest of the world in a proper way. So I would go a step further and say, obviously understand the basics of mining, and then get yourself into a node, run your own Bitcoin node that verifies transactions. Those are the two, I think, most important things for you to do as an individual.
Real quick to qualify this threat. So who's heard of the talks about a strategic Bitcoin reserve, right? What happens with game theory if and when the United States says we're going to start acquiring Bitcoin? Our allies and our adversaries also start accumulating Bitcoin because it's a weapon in that regard, right? People aren't as intimately familiar with mining, but hash rate is also a weapon, right? So we talk about, geographic, dispersion of mining facilities. That's part of the game. But if all of this is feeding, or a significant amount of the hash rate is feeding through two pools, which may or may not be associated with countries we would potentially consider to be adversaries, then that's a weapon in the hands of our potential enemy.
Or those two pools are colluding and we don't know it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I want I'm trying to draw a little bit of an analogy here because I think Bitcoin, strategic reserve, nation state accumulation, that's more kind of understandable. Beneath the surface, hash rate, same concept, right? And I think these guys can opine on that significantly, but that's a way to think about the power of accumulation of hash rate, similar to the power of accumulation of Bitcoin.
Yeah, very good. And Mark, I wanted to this seems like a good time to really talk about the importance of individual miners being able to have their own block template or having control of their own block template. Maybe explain a little bit about how that's not necessarily the case right now, and how that actually contributes to centralization, maybe giving an overview of what a template even is.
Sure. Okay, so a template simply is the list of transactions that you that can get converted into work and given to your miners over the Stratum protocol. It's essentially it's if you are a miner and you find a block, right, that block satisfies the required difficulty and it has the previous hash. So you build the blockchain, it's got all the transactions. So the block template, it's not a new concept, but it's a new term because miners haven't been making their own blocks. I don't know, since like early on 2011, 2012, 2013, when the pools took it over. So and again, maybe just to go back to the sequence. So the mining process starts with running a node. Hands up if you've read the white paper. I'm sure everybody in this room. Okay. Satoshi talks about honest. He uses this term honest nodes like 6 or 7 or 8 times. And I was reading it like the 5th time because it's a hard comprehension. And I was wondering, like, he keeps talking about honest nodes, but there's really no mention of mining, right? In the white paper, aside from the reference to it's kind of like gold mining. So every time he's talking about an honest node, he's actually referring to miners, because in the early days of Bitcoin, there was no distinction between miners and node runners. You had a computer. On the computer, you ran the Bitcoin software, right? And you ran a node and you peered with the network. You built the blockchain, you validated the blocks, you validate transactions, you store a copy of the blockchain. That's what makes.
Early on, there wasn't enough demand, right? Not enough people needing to transact in Bitcoin.
Right.
There was really no need to control. They were desperately just trying to fill blocks.
Right.
with
Yeah. There was definitely more than enough block space to go around. One of the buttons in your node was get Bitcoins. So if you clicked on get Bitcoins, you would essentially use your own compute power of your PC to mine Bitcoin. So nodes and miners were synonymous with each other in the early days. But in order to mine the Bitcoins, you had to run the node. You had to select which transactions you wanted to include. You had the freedom to prioritize different ones in any way that you saw fit. And then you would direct your own hash power to that. And so the evolution of mining pools split the intelligent parts of mining, which is running a node, choosing transactions, building a template, from the raw hashing. So miners became the raw hashers, and pools became the deciders of what goes in the chain. So the template concept is something it's rather simple, but it's foreign to a lot of miners because we haven't been doing it for many years. And it's not difficult to do. We actually wrote at Ocean, we wrote the datum protocol, which essentially, if you want to compartmentalize it, to mine Bitcoin, you need a node, you need a Stratum server. The Stratum server is what translates the transactions into the Stratum protocol, which the ASICs can actually understand. So you need to have a Stratum server combined with an ASIC, combined with a node, in order to mine Bitcoin. And so building a block template is just having a Stratum server. So we made it super easy by creating Datum, and Datum is it's 250 kilobytes. It sits on top of a node. You can run it on a Raspberry Pi, and it empowers miners to such a large degree. It's seen a lot of adoption. I think about 70% of the hash rate, 70 or 80% of the hash rate on our pool are miners who are making their own blocks and in a sovereign way, making their own decisions. They can even add their own transactions in there for free if they want. They can label the blocks their name. Barefoot labels its blocks Barefoot Mining. And there's a lot of customization features within it, but it goes back to the premise of being the entity that actually decides what to put in the chain.
Can I ask Bob? I want to ask Bob on this one. So this gives the miners the choice to choose what kind of transactions they do and don't support, right? It's pretty obvious, I think, if you're talking about a pubco, someone that's just concerned about their profits and loss, their P&L, profits and loss, stock price, things like that. It's pretty obvious. They're always going to be incentivized to try to be as profitable as possible, right? So if something may not be illegal, but may be questionable or ethical, right? But they can still make money on it. They're incentivized to do that. And every shareholder is a boss, right? So that's their incentive. What are some of the potential dangers of that, Bob, just kind of from a high level?
Yeah, you're right. But as a guy who sat in the C-suite at a Fortune 200 public company in the past, not in mining, but in my previous career, I do think there is one piece of that people miss, even a lot of the people in the mining industry, and that's that while you do want to make the most money, you want to make the most money over the long term, not necessarily the short term. So David's correct that right now the large mining companies essentially will put whatever is available that they can get through the nodes. They'll put anything they can get through the nodes in, and they'll somewhat maximize short-term revenue. But the danger is there's several dangers actually, but one is that Bitcoin loses its ability for monetary purposes because it's spending so much time. We will call it spam. Other people may call it other things, but even whether it's noble or not, the inscriptions and the ordinals and the ruins and even Sailor's project for IDs and all those sort of things, those fill up block space. So they're going to increase the price of block space for the average person. They're going to make it more and more difficult to run nodes over time because the amount of storage required to run a node is going to get bigger and bigger. And, I think that there's a certain reality that I think Bitcoiners need to understand, especially like if you own shares in a public mining company. I would hope that what you would do is, as a shareholder, ask them to behave in a way that's the best for the long term of Bitcoin, and that's part of what you're doing. And if they are not, that you put pressure on them. You can do it by voicing to their investors relations people, and if they don't respond to that, you can sell their stock. Like that's how you put pressure on them. I think it's probably a good time too, if I can segue a little bit, to put some numbers around some things, and bear with me for a second, but I think most people know that the average block time, meaning the mean, is 10 minutes, right? If you extrapolate that math, you'll find that there are 53,000 blocks per year created by the network. There's really nothing that we can do to change that number. Each block has a finite size. On a technical basis, it's called 4 million weight units, but for purposes of today's conversation, you could think about it, I'm going to round up actually, we'll call it 4,000 transactions can fit in each block. So that means, do that math, 4,000 transactions times 53,000 blocks a year, that gives you just over 200 million transactions that the network can support on an annual basis. Some will disagree with me, but I don't believe there's anything that will materially change that, certainly in my lifetime, and probably much longer than that. So if you think about 8 billion people in the world, you think about 330 million corporations in the world and 200 million annual transactions, what does that mean? That means there's not that much space. So there will be, these gentlemen all alluded to it to some degree or another, there will be massive competition and wars. Are they people dying or not? I don't know. I wouldn't be shocked me actually if people died over this at some point. I did an interview recently, and one of the things I said was, if I was the president of a small country right now, or even a medium-sized country right now, we'll pick Bolivia as an example, and I had the choice of having 25,000 Bitcoin in the treasury of my country right now, or I could have 1/4 of 1% of the world's hash rate for the next century, I would pick the hash rate, because I would be guaranteeing the economic sovereignty of my nation. I would control about 2 blocks every week. That'd give me about 8,000 transactions, and the business of my country would be secure for the next century. If I take the Bitcoin and I have no hash rate, I'm extremely vulnerable. I think David was with one that talked about the threat that posed, because you may find bigger nation states or bigger organizations that decide you can't move your Bitcoin, you can't get access to your Bitcoin. The more that you couple that, so what I'm saying is that there's some longer talks. I've got several podcasts if you're interested that you can Google me and find them. But basically what this means is nation states are going to mine, and they're going to mine in a big way. Big financial institutions are going to mine, and they're going to mine in a big way. Citibank, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, Mitsui, all these big corporations, they will be, my prediction, 15 years from now, these will be the biggest miners in the world. Not the pubcos, not any of those. They will be the biggest miners. We need the Blockwares and the Barefoots and the Rabbits to still be there, so that there is a portion of the network, a portion of that 200 million that we can still control and manage in the spirit that we currently have within Bitcoin. So Bitcoin success, and this will sound funny, Bitcoin success is to a certain degree its biggest obstacle in this, because the more successful it is, the more that wants to happen.
Yeah, which is excellent. And, of course, Blockspaces is working on a product that can actually help with that kind of, if you want to call it, the commoditization of Blockspace itself. But that kind of leads me to, when you think about all of these, large institutions needing block space, all of these companies that we believe will have Bitcoin in treasury, those companies are going to need tools like they have right now. Usually when you have an asset on your books as a CFO or whatever, you have the ability to collateralize that, move that around, use that as an asset on your books. But there's not really the ability to do that from an infrastructure perspective, would you say, Bob?
Yeah. I mean, this whole thing will change the way CFOs look at the world, the way treasury management occurs, the IT departments. But I'll give you an interesting fact. In 2023, Bank of America's IT budget was $11 billion. So if Bank of America looks at Bitcoin, for instance, as something that's existential to them, in other words, they will either flourish or they will perish based on their participation and control in Bitcoin, which ultimately will come down to control of block space, how much money will they throw at it to make that happen? The entire mining industry in 2023 had revenue of 12 billion. Bank of America spent 11 billion on just their IT budget. So that put some things in perspective. I don't know if I answered your question, but answered some question.
You're talking about protecting your investment, right? If you're exposed to, if you're Bank of America, for-profit company, publicly traded, you want to maximize shareholder return, you have exposure to Bitcoin, your mining provides a lever to protect your investment. Thereby, there's an incentive. I thought your nation state example was spot on. I actually hadn't thought about it through that particular lens, but you're making your future success more certain by controlling that kind of under layer. There's one other point I'll add to that nation state point is it's also a way in that Bolivian example where they can leverage their natural resources. Basically, it's a Bitcoin mining provides an incentive to generate more power, right? That creates jobs. That makes it stimulates economies. So it's really a very accretive proposition if you go soup to nuts on this. You're constantly creating Bitcoin. So you've got that asset. Then you're protecting that by mining Bitcoin, and you're stimulating your economy by leveraging, natural resources to basically protect your investment. So it does become a pretty logical proposition, doesn't it?
I think what I'd be most interested to see is, and this is something that I guess a nice way to kind of push back against that type of a future where, all the big banks, everybody are fighting over it. And you see this already, but nation states are doing it at some large degree. But a lot of people, like Bob, your facility in, is it North or South Carolina?
Hydro?
Yeah, the hydro facility. There's still a lot of opportunities for sovereign individuals, whether they may even be in an oppressed area, right? But they can kind of fly under the radar to some degree to take advantage of all of this energy that geopolitically has been shut down, right? So like hydroelectricity, especially in South America, where one politician says, "Oh, you can't sell that to that country anymore because my cousin married somebody over there and I don't like them," right? It's like weird stuff happens, but we have this ability to take advantage of that. So what I think is interesting about it is you all, at the same time you see all of these big corporations hopping on the mining side, you see all these people that have access to this energy. They have these resources that they have not been able to ever monetize. And they're doing it and they're self-funding it. There's no government interference. There's no subsidies. There's no, political agenda. It is literally them saying, I have access to all this energy that I've never been able to do anything with. And they're able to turn that into something. Well, the only way you could stop a bidax, right, is if you outlawed the internet and took power away from every single person in the US, right? So that's a strong message, but you see that also with the horses. And there's even a couple that I would call elephants, Bob, you know what I mean, that are huge, like hydroelectric dams that are stranded geopolitically that are now taking advantage of Bitcoin and that sort of thing. Bob, can you real quick, kind of at an individual level, you're talking about Blockspace. Have you thought about, because I think about it all the time, it's like if I'm living on a Bitcoin standard, and that's what I'm trying to do now, right? I am mining. A lot of my income comes in the form of sats, right? Figuring out the tax structure is kind of a challenge, but I'm figuring that out, how to do that. But once we figure that out, it's like my concern is how much longer am I going to be able to use to be on the Bitcoin standard like that without having to have some kind of a custodial, do you have any insight into what that could look like? Because like as individuals here who are in Bitcoin, how do I transact it if someone, on ramps and off ramps? What are the challenges there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I answer that, you made also some really good points. What David was referring to was like he asked about my facility in South Carolina, where we own a hydroelectric facility, and we aren't connected to the grid. We create our own energy, and I also have a site now in Indiana, connected to a dairy farm where we produce a couple megawatts based off of the methane from the cow shit of a dairy farm, also not connected to the grid. And I also own several natural gas wells, stranded natural gas wells in Pennsylvania, and we mine off of those. And I call that wild mining, and I call it wild because the opposite of wild is captured, right? So if I'm captured, and I have plenty of on-grid sites too, but I view that as captured mining. I must have permission from somebody else. I am dependent on them fulfilling their obligation. And there's always a chance that either they don't fulfill that obligation, or some regulator or tax authority or something could make my life difficult. So our trend is more toward wild. And by the way, that is where the cheapest energy is. So to I think you were somewhat implied that, but our lowest cost energy sites are in places like that, where I won't get specifics, but let's just say like well under 3 cents per kilowatt hour to generate energy in those places. And on grid, it's pretty hard to find it right now, something like that.
Well, Bob, and oftentimes those are actually cost centers before you come in there and uh, like think about you know, flared gas, right? Like in some places that's literally like a cost. So if you can turn a cost into a revenue, right, into a profit center, it's like a double swing, right? So again, what drives a lot of this is the economic incentive to do that. And in the example of capturing the cow-shaped methane, I mean, there's a noble quest there too. That's an environmentally responsible way to turn a pollutant and a cost center into profit, right?
Yeah, and it, you know, I'm sure you've all heard the narratives that we fight as a community and as an industry, and it's something to throw right back in the face of those people. But David asked a specific question about the, you know, the future. The future, so self-custody and the ability for the individual to have access to the base layer. It's a great question. I gave the numbers before: 8 billion people, 200 million transactions annually. We're going to even put the companies aside for the moment. Well, if you do the math on that, and I said, actually, Larry Lepard and I went on a long drive yesterday, and it's one of the things I told Larry is I said, hey Larry, let's pool our money together, and if we wanted to give, let's say 10,000 sats to everybody in the world, we don't have quite that much, but if we did, it would take us 40 years of 100% consumption of the network to perform that task. Well, that in of itself should tell you, like, hey, block space is going to be really precious in a world that hyper Bitcoinizes and Bitcoin as the base layer. Not everybody can self-custody. It's imprudent on everybody that has Bitcoin. I still recommend that you do self-custody, but do so. The number I would put out there is at least 1 million sats. You do not want to have UTXOs of under 1 million sats. 10 million is even better. Okay, because moving that money in the future, it may cost you just an inordinate percentage of that in the future. I think we're all going to have to get used to the fact that not everybody can self-custody, and so we need better custodial solutions that people can get comfortable with. We're in kind of a funny spot, and what I'm saying is probably sacrilegious to some people. It's not what I want, though. It's just what the math tells us is possible. So I think when everybody knows the word subsidy, okay? So I think most people think of the subsidy as a reward to people that mine when we mine a block. But that was only half of the equation. It was also some part of Satoshi's genius to essentially be subsidizing for users access to the world's most powerful and secure digital network for 16 years. Well, we're reaching the point where that period of free access and almost instantaneous access to this thing is going to go away. One of my favorite quotes is, "A luxury once enjoyed becomes a necessity." And we have had this luxury for a long time, and we have to get used to the fact that at a minimum, we're going to have to pay for it, and we may also have to wait for it. And as long as you guys help us, you know, we'll keep a certain percentage of the network available to all the plebs and all the users. But if we let the elephants and we let the big pools and we let the nation states take over, Bitcoin will still be very valuable. It'll still be really important, but some of the key attributes that most likely everybody in this room believes in Bitcoin for will go away. And but I want to say one other thing.
Yes.
That's very doomsdayish. I love Bitcoin.
End on
I
a
am
high note, Bob.
super-
There you go.
I am super optimistic that we will win this. And part of the reason I come to places like this is by letting people know and understand that this threat exists, we can defeat it. Okay. And so but it's in our hands, right? I've said publicly many times, Bitcoin is money for the next 1,000 years as long as we take care of it. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree. There's things that are coming, whether we like them or not. And so it just becomes, are Bitcoiners going to be doing this, or are adversaries going to be doing this? So it's just kind of the way that it is. I was thinking maybe we could do some Q&A. I don't know how much more time we have. Do we have time?
Yeah, we've got some time for some questions.
Okay. All right.
Please
Yep.
do.
I figured there would be. Yeah, go ahead.
So Bob can speak to the science and math on this a lot better than I can, no question. But what he mentioned earlier, what was so amazing about this? Yes, we'll have to pay for it, but Satoshi kind of built that in, right? So initially, the reward is you're getting Bitcoin. So if you mine a block, right, and you win that block, you guess the right number, and you get that award, you get the Bitcoin that's released into the wild, right? It's not like mining. It's going to happen almost every 10 minutes, no matter what. It just adjusts based on how many computers are pushing, right? So he started out high, right? The incentive is really high as far as a number, not dollar amount, but a number amount, right? Like 50 Bitcoins. And then every 4 years, it goes down to 25. Well, what that step down does is makes it more difficult for people who are not smart about the way they mine and manage their operations. They get shaken out, right? So then there's less demand, or less supply of power and access, and then as Bitcoin becomes more rare. Well, as it becomes more rare, and more people hear about it and start to use it, it becomes more valuable, and then more people build up, and then boom, again, just that cycle. When you hit it again, boom, 4 years, it's done, right?
Supply shock is the concept.
Yeah, it's supply shock, right? That is a perfect incentive to get people in early, right? I'm giving you 50. No, now I'm giving you 25. Now I'm giving you 12 and a half. Now, it keeps moving down, right? At the end, what all will be left is the whatever we are willing to pay for to transact, right? So like right now, I saw on Twitter, I can't remember who it was. Somebody noted on a block, somebody sent enough Bitcoin. It was like over $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, right? And they sent it, and it cost them like $1.50 because the way the network was, they went lowest sats per VByte. They just waited their time. Maybe it didn't come this block. Maybe it came 20 or 30 minutes down the road or whatever, but they got it, right? They were able to do that. But whoever won that block, they got the $1.50 for that one transaction, and they got the Bitcoin, right? As those lines basically crossed on a graph, right? If Bitcoin continues to go up, the value of those fees that we pay could be as much, if not more, valuable, right? And we've seen that actually happen in a couple of instances. Sometimes there were shenanigans taking place, sometimes there wasn't, right? Depending on what you want. But eventually, naturally, by the law of supply and demand, that's just going to happen. More people use it, right? The value of the Bitcoin goes up dramatically. Even if I'm only paying sats per VByte, even if it's lower, but if the Bitcoin's worth more, that is more valuable, right? So the goal is for those two to cross at some point, and I think it'll happen sooner rather than later, where the rewards for transaction are worth more than the Bitcoin you get for winning the block, because every 4 years it gets cut in half.
We're building roads, and then there's like a toll to use those roads. And the more people that want to use those roads, the toll gets more expensive,
Right.
so to speak. And Bitcoin miners have basically two sources of revenue. To David's point, the block subsidy, which, think about the power of this, by the way, it's cut in half every 4 years. Like, juxtapose that with our domestic fiat monetary policy. I have no idea how much money is going to exist in the future. I know exactly how much Bitcoin is going to be released, and when that supply is going to be cut in half from a net new distribution perspective. That's one. The second one is transaction fees, which I think you just uncovered, and that's like the toll roads. More people want to use the roads, it costs more to use the roads, kind of thing.
That's a really good, well, not a, it's a pretty good analogy because in the beginning, well, it is.
Tell me
I'm
how
saying
you feel.
no. The difference here is the value of us driving on that road gets better over time, right? So like, let's say the toll road initially now it's $1 to drive on that toll road, and it saves us 10 minutes on our commute. Maybe its value now, it costs us $2 on that toll road, but it saves us 20 minutes from our commute, et cetera, right? So it's kind of from that aspect. I was just trying to kind of think of a way to
That
tie
was a
that in.
great ham and egg. I was using
Yeah.
a very basic example, and he, I think, brought it into
No, you're right,
perspective.
but he's absolutely right because in the beginning, right, the reward is like the subsidy or the bond. It's like we would issue or take a loan, or some private company would pay for that toll road, right? And the goal is for over time that toll road gets paid off, and then we're supposed to turn off the tolls, but they never do that because it's more valuable, so the transactions stay there, right? So from that aspect, it is a pretty good, but it's also not, there's no games with this toll road, right? Whoever whoever uses it decides how much it costs and how much time it can save, and the users are the ones that kind of decide that timeline, which is what makes it a better solution.
Could you ever see the cost of production of the next Bitcoin going down 50% if the cost of electricity is at half a cent per kilowatt? And if the cost of production went down, the price would drop.
The ability to produce power at that rate is almost non-existent, because even if the input source is free, cow shit, you still have generators and turbines and maintenance costs of that go with that. Depends on how you measure it, but I don't believe you can get under about 1.3 to 1.5 cents. Now, what you can do, and the gentleman from the mining world we're all talking about it for, is you can partner with somebody who can take the output of the mining process, the heat. You find somebody that wants to dry beef jerky or heat a pool or all that. By the way, those great stuff that the plebs can do. You can create an alternative revenue source that can offset it. But in our lifetimes, we're not going to see that happen. So the other thing is, I want to give other people a chance to time, but think of all the electricity in the world. I'll try to do this really quickly. There are 27,000 terawatt hours of electricity generated annually. The cost of that energy is distributed on a bell curve. The middle point is about 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So think of a bell curve like this. Okay, we as an industry consume just under 200 terawatt hours. It's about 190. So about 2/3 of 1% of the world's electricity currently is utilized by our industry. We have found a massive percentage, at least of the big locations on grid, where cost-effective energy is available. There will be new stuff that comes up. There will be places like David referred to where maybe a country like Ethiopia has overbuilt a hydro infrastructure. But there's just so much energy available down there. My models actually show that there hasn't been that much new energy contributed to the network over the last 12 months, even though hash rate has ripped. Most of it has come from replacement cycles. People taking S19s running at 90 terahashes per second and putting in a 234 terahash per second S21 in that. Well, okay, that's 150 extra terahashes coming into the same power source. So, so anyway, the cost of production is unlikely to go down. It's probably about where the operating cost of running a facility is about where it is. You know, what happens with global hash rate and fees really probably the main determiners of how profitable we are.
Yeah.